It all started on a quiet Tuesday night, the kind where everything feels calm and ordinary. I was curled up on my couch in my favorite oversized sweater, sipping chamomile tea that had gone lukewarm because I'd forgotten about it while watching an old mystery show. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the TV and the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. It was peaceful until it wasn't. Suddenly, bright lights flooded through my living room window, startling me so much that I nearly spilled my tea. At first, I thought maybe a car had pulled into the driveway with its high beams on, but when I peeked out from behind the curtain, my stomach dropped. There were 2 police cars parked right outside my house, their red and blue lights flashing like strobe lights at some chaotic party I hadn't been invited to. My heart started racing as I tried to figure out what could possibly be happening. Was there an emergency? Had something bad happened nearby? But then I noticed Mr. Thompson standing near one of the officers. He's part of the Homeowners Association, HOA, board, a man who always seems to think he knows better than everyone else. His khakis looked freshly pressed, and his arms were crossed tightly over his chest, as if he were ready to scold someone. That's when it hit me. Whatever this was, it probably involved me. Before I could even process what was going on, there was a knock at the door. Loud and insistent. My hands trembled as I set down my mug and tightened my robe around me before opening the door. 2 officers stood there, their expressions serious but not unkind. One of them introduced himself as Officer Ramirez, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am," he began, "we received a call about a possible trespasser at this address. Can you confirm your identity?" Identity. Trespasser. This was my asterisk house. I lived here alone, or at least I thought I did until tonight. For a moment, I just stared at him, trying to make sense of the situation. How could anyone think I didn't belong in my own home? But instead of answering right away, I froze, suddenly hyper-aware of how strange this must look. An exhausted woman in pajamas being questioned by the police in her own driveway. Officer Ramirez waited patiently while I fumbled for my ID, which felt like it took forever to find. When I finally handed it over, he checked it carefully against some notes on his phone. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson lingered nearby, looking far too pleased with himself. "See," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I told you something wasn't right." That comment made my blood boil. What exactly had seemed not right to him? Was it the fact that I'd borrowed my brother's truck last week and hadn't moved it yet? Or maybe it was just the shadow of me walking past the windows while making popcorn. Either way, it was infuriating to realize that someone had called the police on me simply because they assumed I didn't belong here. As Officer Ramirez verified my information, the pieces slowly came together. Apparently, Mr. Thompson had spotted movement inside the house and decided to report it without bothering to check if it was actually suspicious. He also mentioned seeing an unfamiliar vehicle in the driveway, the very same truck I'd borrowed from my brother. None of this added up to anything criminal, but here we were, standing under the harsh glow of police lights, dealing with a situation that never should have happened in the first place. By the time Officer Ramirez assured me it was all a misunderstanding and apologized for the inconvenience, I already felt drained. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, except the truck wasn't even mine. It was my brother's, the same one that had somehow turned me into public enemy number 1 overnight. As sunlight streamed through the windows, I tried to shake off the heaviness in my chest, but it clung to me like a second shadow. Last night's events replayed in my mind on an endless loop. The flashing lights, the accusatory stares, and Mr. Thompson's smug expression as he pointed at my house like some self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood. I decided to head out early for coffee, hoping fresh air might clear my head. But as soon as I stepped outside, I noticed the whispers. Mrs. Jenkins from 3 doors down was watering her roses, but she stopped mid-pour to give me a sympathetic smile. "I heard about last night," she said softly, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear us. "That must have been so scary." Scary. No. Infuriating. Absolutely. But instead of correcting her, I forced a tight smile and muttered something vague about how these things happen. Her tone made it clear she didn't believe me, or maybe she thought I was hiding something. Either way, the exchange left me feeling more alienated than ever. It only got worse as I walked down the street. People who usually waved or said hello now avoided eye contact altogether. A few neighbors whispered behind their hands, pretending not to notice me passing by. By the time I reached the corner cafe, I could practically hear the gossip machine whirring in overdrive. Someone probably thought I'd thrown a wild party with strangers. Another might have assumed I was involved in something shady, and all because Mr. Thompson couldn't bother to knock on my door before dialing 911. When I finally sat down with my coffee, my phone buzzed incessantly. Texts and calls poured in from friends asking what had happened. Most sounded concerned, but there was an undertone of doubt in some messages. Even Sarah, my best friend since college, hesitated when I called her later that afternoon. "Are you sure everything's okay?" she asked cautiously. You know, sometimes people exaggerate stories. Her words stung more than I cared to admit. Did she really think I was lying? Or worse, covering up something bad? The truth was simple. I owned this house, lived here alone, and hadn't done anything wrong. But no one seemed willing to take my word for it. Instead, they listened to Mr. Thompson, whose version of events painted me as some shady character lurking in my own home. And then there was him, the man at the center of this mess. Later that evening, I spotted him walking his dog, a tiny terrier named Max who looked far too small to handle being yanked along by its leash. Mr. Thompson glanced up as I approached, his face breaking into a satisfied smirk. "Ah, Miss Carter," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Glad to see everything worked out last night." Worked out? What planet was he living on? My jaw tightened as I stared at him, resisting the urge to say something I'd regret. For the record, I replied coolly, there was nothing to work out. You accused me of trespassing in my own house based on what? Shadows. He shrugged, unfazed. We can't be too careful these days. People need to follow proper protocols. Proper protocols? Was borrowing a vehicle now considered suspicious behavior? And why did he feel entitled to decide what was normal and what wasn't? His casual dismissal of the entire ordeal infuriated me. This wasn't just about him calling the cops, it was about control, about making me feel like I didn't belong in a place where I paid taxes, mowed my lawn, and followed every rule they threw at me. As I walked away, fuming, I realized this wasn't going to blow over anytime soon. Mr. Thompson thrived on drama, feeding off the fear and uncertainty he created. He wanted everyone to believe he was protecting the neighborhood. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't about safety or rules. It was about power, and I wasn't about to let him win. The days that followed felt like living under a microscope. Every move I made seemed to draw unwanted attention, as if the entire neighborhood had turned into amateur detectives, determined to uncover some hidden scandal in my life. The whispers grew louder, the stares more pointed, and the isolation harder to ignore. It wasn't just Mr. Thompson anymore. It was everyone else too, feeding off his version of events and adding their own twists. By Wednesday morning, the rumors had taken on lives of their own. At the grocery store, I overheard two women chatting near the produce aisle. One leaned in conspiratorially, her voice low but still audible. "Did you hear about Emily Carter?" she said, glancing around dramatically. "They say there were strangers staying at her house last week. Someone even saw lights on late at night." Strangers. Late-night lights. My grip tightened on the cart handle as I stood frozen, pretending to examine a bag of apples. For the record, the only stranger who'd been in my house recently was my brother, and the late-night lights were probably me watching TV or reading in bed. But facts didn't matter here. Perception did. To them, I was no longer just Emily Carter, quiet homeowner next door. I was now Emily Carter, mystery woman with something to hide. Even my mailbox became fair game for judgment. When I went to check it later that day, I found another note taped neatly to the front. This one was official looking, bearing the HOA logo and stamped with red ink for extra intimidation. In bold capital letters, it read, asterisk asterisk PLEAC Rayina movie VA kilo or face EFI and ES asterisk asterisk. I crumpled the paper in frustration, my hands shaking. They weren't even trying to hide their hostility anymore. It was bad enough that Mr. Thompson had called the police on me, but now they were piling on petty grievances just to keep me in line. The truck hadn't moved because I hadn't needed to drive anywhere since borrowing it. Was that really such a crime? That evening, I called my brother to vent. He listened quietly as I recounted everything. The flashing lights, the accusations, the gossip, and then sighed heavily. You know what this is, don't you? He said finally. It's not about the truck or shadows or whatever nonsense they're using as excuses. It's about control. They want to make an example out of you. His words hit uncomfortably close to home. Maybe he was right. Maybe this wasn't personal. It was strategic. By targeting me, they hoped to send a message to anyone else who dared step out of line. But I wasn't ready to roll over and play along. Not yet. The breaking point came Friday afternoon when I spotted Mr. Thompson chatting with another neighbor outside his house. They both glanced toward my driveway, laughing about something. Whatever it was, it couldn't have been good. Anger bubbled inside me until I couldn't contain it anymore. I marched across the street, clutching the crumpled HOA notice in my fist. What's so funny? I demanded, stopping directly in front of them. Both men looked startled, though Mr. Thompson recovered quickly, smoothing his expression into practiced neutrality. Nothing important, he replied smoothly. Just discussing community standards. Community standards? I repeated, incredulous. You mean harassing people for parking borrowed cars in their driveways, or calling 911 because you think someone might be moving around inside their own house? He raised an eyebrow, unbothered by my tone. Rules are rules, Miss Carter. If you can't comply, there will be consequences. Consequences. That word hung in the air between us, heavy and loaded. Who did he think he was? Some kind of suburban sheriff doling out punishments for minor infractions. And why did everyone let him get away with it? As I walked back to my house, my mind raced. I couldn't keep letting him win, chipping away at my dignity piece by piece. Something had to change, not just for me, but for everyone else who lived under the shadow of his self-appointed authority. I didn't know exactly how I'd fight back yet, but one thing was certain. I was done playing by his rules. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a whirlwind of frustration, anger, and determination. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Thompson's smug face, heard his condescending tone when he said, "Rules are rules." It wasn't just about the truck or the 911 call anymore. It was bigger than that. This was about standing up for myself, not just for my own sake, but for everyone else who felt powerless against the HOA's overreach. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, staring at the crumpled notice they'd left on my mailbox. The words, "Please remove vehicle," or "face EVINES," mocked me in bold capital letters. Fines. For what? For living my life. It was absurd, and yet here we were. I thought about all the other neighbors who must have faced similar nonsense. People too afraid to speak up because they didn't want to become targets like me. Then it hit me. I wasn't alone in this fight. Sure, I might be the one in the spotlight right now, but there had to be others who were silently suffering under the weight of these ridiculous rules. Maybe they'd been fined for something trivial, like hanging holiday decorations a day late or planting flowers that weren't on some pre-approved list. If I could show them they weren't alone, if I could rally them behind me, maybe we could take back some control. The next morning, I started digging. First, I went online and pulled up every document I could find about the HOA, bylaws, meeting minutes, financial reports, anything that might give me ammunition. What I found shocked me. There were records of frivolous fines issued for things like mismatched curtains or lawn ornaments deemed too quirky. One family had even been threatened with legal action for hosting a small birthday party without prior approval. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a culture of fear disguised as order. Armed with this information, I decided to write a letter, not just to the HOA but to every single resident in Willow Creek. I wanted to lay everything out clearly, so no one could twist the truth or brush it aside. I included screenshots of text messages where Mr. Thompson admitted to assuming I was a trespasser based solely on circumstantial evidence. I attached photos of my brother's truck registration and a copy of my mortgage papers proving ownership of the house. But most importantly, I shared stories from other neighbors I'd uncovered during my research, showing how widespread the problem really was. When the letters were ready, I hand-delivered them to every mailbox in the neighborhood. Some people looked surprised to see me, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Still, I made sure each envelope reached its intended recipient. By the time I finished, my feet ached, but I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. For once, I wasn't staying silent. I was taking action. Later that evening, I called a special HOA meeting, inviting not only residents but also local journalists. Word spread quickly, and by the time the meeting rolled around, the community center was packed. People filed in cautiously, unsure what to expect. Mr. Thompson sat near the front, looking unusually uneasy, flanked by his usual group of supporters. But as I stood up to speak, the room fell silent, all eyes on me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this wouldn't fix everything overnight, but at least I was planting seeds of change. And if enough people joined me, maybe we could finally put an end to the reign of fear that had gripped our neighborhood for far too long. When I stood up to speak at the packed community center, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The room was eerily quiet, every eye fixed on me. Some faces were curious, others skeptical, and a few, like Mr. Thompson's, looked downright hostile. But I reminded myself why I was there, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against the HOA's heavy-handed rules. I started by thanking everyone for coming, my voice steady despite the nerves twisting in my stomach. I know this meeting might seem unusual, I began, but what happened to me last week wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a symptom of something much bigger. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in before continuing. I held up the crumpled notice they'd taped to my mailbox and explained how it felt to be treated like a criminal in my own home. Then I shared screenshots of the text messages where Mr. Thompson admitted he'd assumed I was trespassing based solely on shadows and a borrowed truck. "Does that sound reasonable to anyone here?" I asked, scanning the crowd. No one spoke, but a few heads shook in agreement. Next, I turned to the stories I'd uncovered. The fines for mismatched curtains, the threats over birthday parties, the endless nitpicking about harmless details. These aren't isolated incidents, I said firmly. They're part of a pattern. A culture where people are made to feel afraid of making even the smallest decisions about their own homes. As I spoke, I watched the mood in the room shift. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, some nodding slowly as if realizing they weren't alone. One woman raised her hand tentatively. "They fined me $200 because my wind chimes were too loud," she admitted, her voice trembling with frustration. Another man chimed in, saying he'd been warned about his garden gnome being non-compliant. Each story added fuel to the growing fire of discontent. Mr. Thompson tried to interrupt, leaning forward with that same smug expression he always wore. "These rules exist to maintain property values," he insisted, his tone dripping with authority. "If we don't enforce them consistently, things will spiral out of control." But this time, no one nodded along. Instead, murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Property values don't matter if we can't live peacefully in our own homes." Another neighbor added, "This isn't about enforcement. It's about bullying." The tension in the room was electric, and for the first time, I saw cracks in Mr. Thompson's carefully constructed facade. His usual confidence wavered as more people stood up to share their grievances. By the end of the meeting, the once unified front of the HOA board had fractured, with even some members questioning whether the rules had gone too far. Before wrapping up, I proposed a vote, not just to address my situation, but to review and revise the HOA guidelines altogether. Let's work together to create rules that make sense for everyone, I urge, not ones that punish us for living our lives. The room erupted into applause, and when the ballots were counted, the decision was unanimous. Mr. Thompson would step down as head of the HOA, and a committee would be formed to overhaul the outdated policies. As I sat back down, exhausted but triumphant, I realized something important. Change doesn't happen overnight, but sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say, enough. The fallout from that meeting hit Mr. Thompson harder than I think anyone expected, including him. For weeks, he had strutted around the neighborhood like he owned it, his clipboard always in hand, his opinions delivered with an air of unquestionable authority. But now, stripped of his title and influence, he looked smaller somehow. At the next HOA gathering, he sat slumped in the back corner, avoiding eye contact as the new committee took charge. Gone was the smug smirk. In its place was a man who suddenly realized his reign of control was over. But while Mr. Thompson faded into the background, the real work began for the rest of us. The newly formed committee, a mix of neighbors eager to make things right, started reviewing every rule, no matter how minor. We held open discussions where people could voice their frustrations or suggest changes. It wasn't always smooth sailing. Some debates grew heated, especially when it came to issues like holiday decorations, how early was too early, or parking regulations. Could guests leave their cars overnight? Still, there was a sense of hope in the air, a feeling that we were finally working together instead of against each other. One of the first big victories came when we scrapped the ridiculous fine system altogether. Instead of punishing people for tiny infractions, we implemented a warning process that gave homeowners a chance to fix any issues without fear of financial penalties. When Mrs. Jenkins accidentally painted her shutters a shade darker than approved, she received a friendly note reminding her of the guidelines, not a bill for $500. She thanked me later, saying it felt like a weight had been lifted. Another win was the overhaul of the approval process for gatherings. Previously, hosting anything larger than a family dinner required submitting forms weeks in advance and getting clearance from the board. Now, casual get-togethers didn't need permission at all, and bigger events only required a quick heads-up to avoid noise complaints. Neighbors started opening their homes again, cookouts, birthday parties, even book clubs, and the community felt warmer, more connected. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about the changes. A small group of residents grumbled that we were lowering standards by loosening the rules. They clung to the old ways, muttering about property values and aesthetic harmony. But most of us knew better. This wasn't about lowering standards. It was about raising spirits. Our neighborhood wasn't just a collection of houses. It was a place where people lived, laughed, and built memories. And those things mattered far more than perfectly trimmed hedges or paint colors approved by some outdated checklist. As the months went by, the atmosphere in Willow Creek transformed. People smiled at each other again, waved hello, and lingered longer during chats over fences. The gossip mill slowed down, replaced by conversations about shared goals rather than suspicions. Even my brother's truck, which had once been the source of so much drama, became a running joke among neighbors. Someone even taped a sign to it one morning that read, "Officially approved by the new HOA." We laughed about it for days. Looking back, I realized something profound. Standing up to injustice isn't just about winning. It's about creating space for others to thrive. By challenging Mr. Thompson and the toxic culture he represented, I hadn't just reclaimed my own dignity. I'd helped others find theirs too. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but it was ours. and that made all the difference. Months later, Willow Creek felt like a completely different place. The tension that had once hung thick in the air was gone, replaced by a sense of calm and connection. It wasn't just about new rules or a revamped HOA. It was deeper than that. People were kinder, more patient, and genuinely interested in each other's lives again. Neighbors who barely knew each other before were now swapping recipes at the mailbox or teaming up to organize block parties. The change was subtle but undeniable. Willow Creek had rediscovered its heart. For me, life finally settled into a rhythm I could enjoy. My mornings started with coffee on the porch, watching kids ride their bikes down the street while parents chatted nearby. Sometimes, Mrs. Jenkins would stop by with a plate of cookies fresh from her oven, insisting I take them for being such a brave soul. Even Mr. Thompson kept his distance, though I occasionally caught him glaring at my brother's truck when he thought no one was looking. Still parked proudly in my driveway, it had become something of a symbol, a reminder that standing your ground can lead to real change. The holidays rolled around, bringing twinkling lights and wreaths to every door. For the first time, there were no restrictions on decorations, no deadlines, no inspections, just joy. Houses sparkled with personality, some covered in colorful lights, others adorned with handmade ornaments. One neighbor even erected a giant inflatable snowman that leaned slightly to one side, earning both laughs and applause. When someone joked about reporting it to the HOA, we all burst out laughing because, for once, none of us cared. As the year drew to a close, I attended the final HOA meeting of the season. The room buzzed with energy as committee members shared updates, fewer complaints, higher attendance at community events, and plans for a neighborhood garden in the spring. Someone suggested renaming the HOA to reflect our new approach, maybe calling it the Willow Creek Community Alliance instead. The idea sparked cheers and applause, and I couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just an organization anymore. It was a partnership. Afterward, Sarah pulled me aside, her eyes shining. "You know," she said, "you really changed things around here. I don't think anyone will forget what you did." Her words caught me off guard, not because they were unexpected, but because they reminded me how far we'd come. At first, I'd fought back out of frustration and anger, determined to protect myself from unfair treatment. But along the way, I realized it wasn't just about me. It was about showing everyone that they had a voice, and that using it could make a difference. That night, as I sat by the fire reflecting on everything, I thought about what made a house a home. It wasn't the paint color, or the landscaping, or the perfectly aligned shutters. It was the people, the laughter, the shared struggles, the moments that bound us together. Rules could guide us, but they couldn't define us. That was something only we could do. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, and I doubted it ever would be. Life didn't work that way. But it was ours, a patchwork of stories, quirks, and dreams stitched together by the people who called it home. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly grateful to be part of it.